Now, having said that, if you go back with me to Romans 1, please. Romans chapter 1. Where we learn that creation, things are clearly seen and understood by the things that are made. You know, as I said, just a few of the things we know today. We know our Earth orbits once a year around the sun. And they say it does it. It covers 200 million miles in a yearly orbit. Now, to do that, it has to go 66,000 miles an hour. You can't feel it, but we're moving 66,000 miles an hour. And it does it precisely in 365 days, 5 hours, 48 minutes, and 48 seconds. And never veers off course, and never loses a millisecond. Think that takes design? And so they are without excuse. And so we see this section here in Romans, once it declares the wrath of God is revealed, then begins with a revelation of God in creation. That was verses 19 and 20. The revelation of God in creation. But may I again remind you how the chapter ended. Look again at verse 32. Verse 32. Who, knowing the judgment of God, that they which commit such things are worthy of death, not only do the same, but have pleasure in them that do them. So it ends with the righteous retribution of God, the punishment of God, the judgment of God. So how can we begin with the revelation of God and end with the retribution of God? That is the answers of verses 21 through 31. Why is righteousness just? It's just not a bad mood. It is deserved. And it's deserved by all. Therefore, all need God's salvation. If he's going to present salvation, good news, he must give mankind a reason why. And why we need to be saved is because of the great truth of the judgment of God. The legality that we looked at last week is not why we need to be saved. That's our assurance that we are saved. And so on. Even the love of God is not why we need to be saved. That's why he reaches out. But the judgment of God is why a person needs to be saved. Is the first thing he deals with in detail in the book of Romans. So now let's look at how you get from the revelation of God to the righteous retribution of God. So look at verse 21 now. You're going to see a downward spiral here. And it's going to answer the pagan societies of his day and our day, so to speak. How does a pagan get to be totally depraved? How does he get to be so dark in his thinking and his actions? Well, he's going to tell you how. Look at how a pagan becomes pagan. Verse 21. Verse 21. Romans 1, verse 21. Because that when they knew God, they glorified him not as God, neither were thankful. They knew God. You might not see it in their heart, but creation reveals it, and every person has a knowledge of God, even without the Bible. They knew God. But the first step here is the rejection of the revelation of God in creation, is rejection. Look at verse 21 again. Because that when they knew God, they glorified him not as God, neither were thankful. They would not give him the glory. You're the creator, you need to be submitted to, we need to seek you. And they weren't thankful for whatever he brought into their life. And there was a rejection of God in his glory. And they weren't thankful. It was a deliberate choice. They were ungodly, no God in their life. And so there is a deliberate rejection of God. You don't see it in the heart. All you see is the results. You say, well, they can't help it. Remember how it starts out? They could help it. When they knew God, they glorified him not as God, neither were thankful. So it begins with the rejection of God in the revelation he gave them in creation. Now, when they reject God, when there's that deliberate, I know God, but I won't glorify, I'm not thankful. When that happens, some symptoms start to kick in. And I emphasize tonight, brothers and sisters, the word symptoms. The root cause, they knew God, and they wouldn't glorify him as God. Now look at the first symptom of this rejection of God in creation in verse 21. I'll reread verse 21. Because that when they knew God, they glorified him not as God, neither were thankful, but became vain or empty in their imaginations, and their foolish heart was darkened. Mankind then begins to rationalize. You see, when you walk out of light, all that's left is darkness. You walk out of the revelation of God, all you're left with is darkness. We see them in darkness. But we need to ask how they got there. And Romans will tell you they knew God, but they wouldn't glorify Him as God. And so rationalization sets in. They began to profess themselves to be wise. Look at verse 22. Professing themselves to be wise, they became fools. They claim to be wise. They have doctorates and scientific degrees after their name, and they'll come up with this rationalization of our existence and the answers to life and say somehow we went from the goo to the zoo to you. And they believe stuff like that. That we, and the most intelligent design on earth, living creatures, came from no designer. You know, I had a friend in college, he had a professor who was teaching this garbage here, and my friend argued the intelligent design and used some of the statistics on creation and the earth orbiting and so on. And he said, how do you explain that, professor, without a designer? The professor thought for a minute. He said, I think I can. He reached into his desk and he got one of those paddles that had a rubber band and a red rubber ball. You ever remember those? And he said, and the professor took it, he swirled it like this, and the red rubber ball started to go around. He said, young man, what do we call that principle? He said, we call it centrifugal force. And the professor said, that's the answer, it's centrifugal force. Said, all right, professor, God gave my friend wisdom. He said, I just have one more question. Who's holding and moving the paddle of the universe like you're going to that? Man had no answer. You see, they profess themselves to be wise, but they become fools. And so you can expect the society that has rejected the revelation of God in creation, you can expect rationalization and darkness. That's only a symptom. Now, once they begin to do that, there's a digressive road here. It goes deeper. Look what happens next in verse 23. Verse 23. And change the glory of the uncorruptible God into an image, made like unto corruptible man, and to birds, and to four-footed beasts, and creeping things, or insects. What we have here is religious perversion. They begin to pervert the image of the knowledge of God. And they created God in their own image. And they begin to think God must be like them, or Mother Earth, as they call it, as they look around. And notice their concept of God in this religious perversion is they change the glory of the uncorruptible God into an image made like an incorruptible man. And watch it go down. And birds and four-footed beasts and creeping things like insects, like centipedes. It just keeps going down, 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 down their understanding. And it's defamation to God. You ever in school, sometimes when we had class pictures back in those days, some guy would get a hold of a picture of a girl and want to tease her and put a long beard on her and a mustache, and she'd be quite offended. To make God into some statue of that, and like a creeping thing, is offensive to God. Something that can't move, a totem pole, and can't breathe. It doesn't depict the everlasting God. And so we see religious perversion of God. Now, once that happens, look what happens next. Once man rejects God in creation, revelation of God in creation, he begins to rationalize. That rationalization will lead him to the religious perversion of God. When that happens, look at verse 24, how it begins. Wherefore God also gave them up. Now look how verse 26, what the beginning of 26 says. For this cause God gave them up. Look at verse 28. And even as they did not like to retain God in their knowledge, God gave them over. God gives them up, God gives them up, God gave them over. What you have here, brothers and sisters and friends, is the present phase of God's wrath. There is a present phase to his wrath, and there's a future phase to it. In fact, may I remind you the careful language of 1:18, where we began. The wrath of God is revealed. The wrath of God is revealed. There is a present phase of God's wrath revealed on societies. Make no mistake about it, there is a future phase also. In fact, Romans 2 will talk about it if you just glance over there for a minute and look at verse 5. Romans 2 and verse 5. And after thy hardness and impenitent or unrepentant heart, treasure up unto thyself wrath against a day of wrath and revelation of the righteous judgment of God. There is a day of wrath coming. Revelation 6:17 describes it this way. For the great day of his wrath is come. Who shall be able to stand? And you and I usually think of the day of wrath, and correctly so, as divine intervention. When the heavens are no longer silent, And there'll be earthquakes and hailstones up to 100 pounds and all kinds of cataclysms falling from heaven as the infrastructure of planet Earth is destroyed. We think of wrath, and rightly so, in the book of Revelation as divine intervention. And that is exactly the characteristic of the future phase of God's coming wrath. But you know, as we're going to read here, of this present phase of God's wrath in Romans 1 is not divine intervention, it is no intervention. You say, how can no intervention be wrath? Let me explain.